I'm really glad you just described in a very careful and nuanced way how the different elements have been working or not working. I mean, I would say actually AUKUS has proved overall to be a net minus because it has, for example, alienated Indonesia, which felt that Australia, by, in a sense, violating the non-proliferation regime that it belonged to, was actually now becoming a source of discomfort in the region, of course. But as we know, the Morrison government is gone, and now we have to wait and see what the new Albanese government will do. There will definitely be some differences within the Morrison and Albanese government. But, at the same time, I think you also pointed out that even India, for example, doesn't want to go full hook, line and sinker and say we are all the way with you against China and certainly not all the way with you against Russia for sure. All this shows that you got to make very careful, subtle, sophisticated judgments, on Asian countries. And I'm going to ask you a question about the two main strategic thinkers, Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan. They are supposed to be formulating their policies towards Asia. I wonder whether they have come to realize that perhaps the world that they thought they were walking into in Asia is not the world that they have actually walked into. And are they thinking or preparing possibly a new or different approach towards Asia?
I haven't seen great evidence of it yet. There are some signs in recent weeks that dialogue between the US and China has stepped up.
Increased, yes. Wang Yi and Blinken and Yang Jiechi and
Jake Sullivan have had long conversations. These are not 20-minute conversations. These are hours, 4 hours, exactly. Which is a good thing.
Yes.
I think this is a wonderful thing. And I think...
that's what creates peace, talking.
Yes. Talking is essential to peace. Without that, there is no peace possible.
Yes.
So I think there is some movement in that direction, which I'm very encouraged by. What it needs to be followed up with is much more. Now, in terms of the strategic thinking of the Biden team, as I said, there is this sense that China will, if not constrained, it will overwhelm the United States in many ways. In fact, President Biden made a statement in his first press conference. He said that under his watch, China will not become the world's leading country, will not become the world's wealthiest country, and will not become the world's greatest power. Now, when I read that statement, I was puzzled because what he was saying was that presumably he wants it beyond his term, that China, with 4 times the population, is destined to be at a GDP that's the same as the US. So an average Chinese person should be destined to live at 1/4 the living standards of an average American. You can leave aside the ethics of it because it's international relations. It's about competition, some would argue. But the question is whether it's possible, whether this is a goal that the United States should have for itself, rather than a goal as to where it stands, whether how American citizens do better than they did last year. Ronald Reagan said it best. He said, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" In his election campaign in 1980. It was the single most effective sentence that he asked the American people. And I think
there's a picture of me shaking hands with him there.
Yes, indeed, as with many other leaders, of course.
Yeah,
I think that's the disconnect. The disconnect between the American elite, not all of them, but many of them, and the American people that today are suffering from a very high level of inflation, that are increasingly finding 18-year-old young men break into classrooms and kill little kids, that are seeing homelessness grow, that are continuing to see a healthcare crisis, are perhaps less concerned about how well Chinese live across the other side of the planet. Perhaps they're more concerned about solving their own problems in the here and now. And this is a disconnect, I think, where the foreign policy of the middle class promised by the Biden team hasn't yet been practiced or being translated into actual policies.
I'm glad you emphasized that a foreign policy for the middle class hasn't worked. And I want to emphasize that, as you know, the United States has a lot of friends in Asia. And ASEAN actually was created as a pro-American organization in 1967. And when ASEAN was created, it was denounced by Moscow. It was denounced by Beijing. So there still remain huge reservoirs of goodwill towards the United States in Southeast Asia. And the Southeast Asian countries want the United States to do well. But precisely because we want the United States to do well, we actually believe that thanks to American education, the best way to do well is actually to open yourself up to trade. This is a lesson we learned from Washington, D.C., that you should sign free trade agreements and you should also cut down on trade tariffs. And instead, the shocking thing for many Southeast Asians is that, even though Economics 101 teaches us that trade tariffs, as Janet Yellen, I think, will teach in any classroom, don't really help the American people. They actually harm the American people because they harm American consumers, American workers, American competitiveness. And one would have thought that at least the easiest thing that Joe Biden could have done would have been to at least remove the tariffs or reduce the tariffs against China. But here again, I would say 19, 20 months have passed, and there is still no prospect of any of the tariffs being lifted. So how do you explain that after the United States has convinced us Southeast Asians that trade is good for you, United States is now doing the opposite? What's the justification they have for that?
You made a lot of good points just now, Kishore. One of the things you said was how much Asian prosperity has been linked to American policies.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is no question. The United States has been a very positive player, apart from the Vietnam War, sad episode of the war. Outside of that, its economic and trade policies have defeated communism in this part of the world, have shown in many ways, and combined with the hard work of the region, of course. And that still remains. The US remains the biggest investor in ASEAN. The problem is that trade has become securitized in the United States. It has become a third rail, what's called the third rail of American politics. You touch it and you die. Both parties are very shy of signing new trade deals. The Congress has become very tough on trade deals. So I think the Biden team would agree with you. The Biden team, in private, they would probably agree. They would want the U.S. to come back to some of these agreements.
Come back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
For example, the CPTPP, the gold standard in trade agreements in Asia. I think if they had their own vote alone, they would want in. But the politics gets in the way. Now, how do you overcome a politics that is, let's say, not aligned with the national interest? You do that through leadership. You need a strong leader and a functioning political system to overcome populist strains that sort of push anxiety in the mix. And leadership is about pushing back against that anxiety and giving hope to the people. America has produced many such presidents. One hopes that the current president and the future ones are able to find that magic formula to achieve that sort of leadership. I would also say that there are some attempts being made by the US outside of trade agreements. The Indo-Pacific economic framework is a sign that the US at least has recognized that it needs to be back in the game. The problem is, of course, we don't know enough about it yet.
And there's no trade dimension to it at all,
Also,
unfortunately.
a big weakness.